Well, welcome back. This is the final part, which we called reconciliation, but I don't know if we will get this far today. But just a reminder for the people who are online that it's always possible to ask questions, and for everybody here also. So we start off as a panel discussion because I think it's good to try to bring out the 3 or 4 modalities that we discussed, or models, and see if the panel can save the earth. Maybe I can kick it off a bit because during lunch, Pratik came. Oh, people don't understand biology, and so it's maybe good to bring that out in a few sentences, not an in-depth, but yeah.
So I've been having a strong reaction, not just these last 2 days, but for a long time, when about this sort of distinction between psychology and biology, and don't people understand that there is no psychology without biology, although there certainly is a biology without psychology, and any so-called psychological process has a biological process that underlies it, and that is essential and obligatory. And so the and I'm not sure if he meant to bring it out in that particular manner or not, but the way David formulated those positions helped a lot, and I wanted to say, that's what the problem is, because the way I heard it, there was an equation of conflating of genetics and biology firstly, but an equating of that with some sort of determinism, like if this is your biology, then these are the characteristics you're going to have, and also a lumping of that with evolution, that evolution says the genetic differences and this is how they're produced, and then when there are these, then there are such and such consequences, a very deterministic view, and there seems to be some malleability in psychological processes in that they can change, and things that have biological underpinnings maybe can't, or maybe not as much, and so I want to as emphatically as I can tell you that that's not the fact of the matter, that there's this phenomenon called developmental plasticity. So even genetic makeup is not destiny at all. And biology by no means is deterministic. It is tremendously malleable, changeable, and the time in life when it's the most changeable, more than any other time in life, is the time of development. So briefly, if you consider the starting point in time for any of us, when did any of us come into existence? What was the time before which we did not exist? Then the starting point for each of us is that moment in time when that egg from our mother was fertilized by that particular sperm from our father. That's the starting point, when you start with a fertilized egg. And at that point in time, the genetic makeup is determined technically in a period of 2 days after that, but never mind that. So then that's fixed, and the genetic makeup doesn't change. And if anybody is interested in epigenetics, we can talk about that later. That's not the same as genetic makeup. But then what kind of characteristics? So what is fixed and what is not fixed? What is fixed is that the thing that develops from this will be a human, in that it'll have 2 arms, 2 legs, 10 fingers, 2 eyes. Those are high penetrance traits. But what size brain will it eventually have, given adequate nutrition? What will be the size of the lungs? What will be the properties of these systems? What will be the properties of the brain? very, very, very small proportion of that variation is fixed at that time. And it is almost entirely a consequence of developmental processes. When we in biology use the word environment, we use that as a shortcut for anything outside the genes. So even the conditions in the cell, in the uterus, in the body, in the outer world, the word is environment for that, in case you didn't know, for a biologist. And so there's this this notion that is absolutely incorrect, that biology is destiny, biology is fate. It couldn't be further from the fact of the matter. And what I'm saying, I don't believe at all is a question of opinion. And when I said that, someone said, oh, that's a difference of opinion. And I said, that's like saying, to someone who says the earth is flat, that we're having a difference of opinion. Anyway, that's enough for now.
I would like to just provide one more example of what Pathik was talking about from non-humans, which is part of what I was trying to do yesterday, to point out how much plasticity, to use this word that we invoked yesterday, how much variability there is in organisms, even those which we don't consider to have consciousness or culture or complex sociality. There are several species of salamanders, wherein, depending on the environment in which they are growing up as larvae, which if they were frogs we'd call them tadpoles, but it's just salamander larvae that look like tadpoles. If they're growing up with a lot of siblings, they end up becoming vegetarians, and they have guts that can process plants, and they have small teeth, and they're kind of slow. And if they grow up with a number of members of their species that aren't related to them, they become fierce, big-headed, big-toothed cannibals. This has nothing to do with their active choice. It's not conscious, and it's not good or bad, right? I mean, this is part of what I think both Pathik and I are saying, is that there's no moral judgment on it, but the environment, in the way that most everyone would understand the environment to be in this case, the actual members of the pond that they are growing up among, actually affects physically what they look like and what they can eat later on as adults.
Now you have the microphone. I would just like to ask you. I think also there was what I heard is it's a little bit unclear how the strategy you proposed of mythology, or how that is a strategy for bringing about change, or maybe even help with how do you say, solving the global crisis, or bringing about a change in humans that might solve the global. So that the rational and the scenario is not that clear yet. Yeah. Okay.
I'm not going to be able to spell out that scenario completely, and it is itself incomplete, I would say. To go back to your framing of the three, individual change will affect global change. Sort of narrative level change will affect global change, and policy group action level change, either top down or bottom up, will affect global change, as I understood the three to be. I think taken on their own, if we had to choose one, we need to do it by policy. But those policies will be more effective if we can change belief structure through story, through myth. Now, can story and myth be more likely to take shape, to grip people's imaginations if individuals have done the work that they need to do to become more whole within themselves? Probably. I don't think it's necessary, and the problem with putting individual level change at the front of the goal to actually affect the global population is one of game theory, which is to say that you need to have buy-in from every single individual on the planet, and you need to make sure that none of them cheat. and cheaters exist. Cheaters will always evolve in any system that is evolutionary, and we are an evolutionary system. So by changing belief structures more globally and by affecting policies that are fair and just, then we can separately, in tandem, in parallel, also be working on personal change. And I think they can all go in the same direction, but in terms of what needs to lead the charge, I think the individual level change has the least chance of actually affecting the global level, society level change that we were talking about would need to happen in the next 20 to 50 years.
Yeah, sorry, I keep taking us back to India, but because we face these problems, so we kind of I want to talk about it a little bit. I mean, everybody hears about it, that there's a lot of violence in India insofar as women are concerned, and these things about rape and stuff keeps happening. The by default response that the legislatures have to it is to just make laws more stringent. I practice law, and I see how ineffective that always is, at least in our context. So recently what happened is that roughly less than a 12-year-old girl was raped and murdered in Kashmir. And the government, what it did is brought out an ordinance saying that if there is a crime of that nature takes place, then the automatic punishment will be a death sentence. It reminded me of Grecian saying many years ago, and I don't remember the exact words, but it was something to the extent that the more immoral and crooked the society becomes, the more you will see that society has the number of laws. The more the number of laws, you can directly see that society in general will be very, very disorganized, extremely violent and immoral in their conduct with human beings. The protest that came around is that whenever we try to address these problems by making law very, very stringent, inevitably we find that, and in the example of rape, we've seen basically what happens is that the perpetrator of the crime finds it more lucrative to murder after the rape than to leave the person, because they want to just kill all the evidence. So instead of having a positive effect, it actually has a counterproductive effect on what we really want to achieve. What we want to achieve is not to punish somebody, right? What we want to achieve is to prevent the very act from happening. And at least in the Indian context, it proves to be a total failure. The making of the law to be far more stringent in any way whatsoever, because and this is something which takes us back to criminology, the study of criminology, that we see that in Scandinavia, they have their own problems, of course, and every society has its own problems. But we see in Scandinavia that they that they don't have any capital punishment, right, in Scandinavia. And the way they approach it is that they say that, look here, this person is mentally ill. For a person to have committed a crime of this nature requires a certain amount of illness of the human mind. And what needs to be done is this man needs to be sort of restructured in a way that he can again become a positive member of the society, and he can live peacefully with everybody else. That approach, when you juxtapose with the Indian approach, which is just make things everything, just give capital punishment for everything, stone the person, or what they do extremely in Saudi Arabia, which is even worse. And I'm just trying to see that a society which doesn't do that seems to have a far better way of approaching these problems. They have a more organized society, a more structured society, as compared to where we try to make or try to change this by coercive policies, and it becomes counterproductive. Yeah.
So if you're equating the suggestion of effect things through policy change with things like death sentence, then you're totally off the mark, because that's not at all what is covered in the whole scope and breadth of policy change. So policy change would be make it mandatory for girls to attend school, make it mandatory for certain amount of reservation for women. This produces a certain degree of education, job skills, empowerment, which strongly corresponds at the population level with a reduction in atrocities against people like women. Those are all policy changes that will be, and in places where they've been done, have been proven to be far more effective in ultimately preventing things like this kind of aggression and violence and rape against women, and many other things at the same time. So that's not a good example. No, hold on. That's simply not. No, just hold on now. And then, no, but I want to call. But what I want to remind us is, in this discussion, we said let's examine the assumptions for these approaches, and then let's discuss whether those assumptions seem reasonable, tenable. Let's at least bring them to light, like Jaap said. Let's make them explicit that with approach A, there's assumption number 1, number 2, number 3. With approach B, there's assumption number 5, 7, and 9. I think it would be good to continue with that. That's my proposal.
Yeah. And I was just thinking because I think we haven't, like on the individual scenario, the individual change, maybe not first, because the other, I wouldn't go for first for the other, but the individual change, there might actually be more to it, because of course we simplified it, and so one aspect that we haven't taken in consideration is like interconnectedness. Now, so it could be, and so now we're entering an area of maybe speculation or non-speculation. So one way of looking at it, so which model are we looking at it? Is it so that if you by yourself have this epiphany or insight into something, that it's an isolated event and it's only for you only, and that doesn't affect anything else, you know, so it remains with you and you only, and then you're just one light in the middle of lot of darkness. But there's alternatively, and at least Krishnamurti's work, it speaks to that, that consciousness is one, that there is no, that human consciousness, that an effect on one somewhere will affect the rest of consciousness, especially very strong things. I mean, he says that in the bad sense, some individuals have a tremendous effect on human consciousness, like people like Hitler or something, in the bad way. But also on the other way, some religious movements had a tremendous effect on the human psyche. So, according to that reasoning, and of course, we cannot, nobody can say, okay, well, I'm going to believe that or not believe that. But I mean, in discussions with Bohm and Krishnamurti, there will be a reference made to, like, well, if 10 people would really be having an insight, this will dramatically impact humanity. So, and I don't know if maybe, you know, and then so a little bit in that along that area, just to illustrate a bit. There's one scientist, and I don't know how reliable that is, but okay, he says, okay, if some animals pick up something in one place, then apparently the animals can pick it up also somewhere else. So that actually, without them being interconnected with that. But okay, yeah.
So we are interconnected in more ways than we yet know, and in more ways than we may ever know. That is true. But so the framing of your question earlier, when you were sitting over there, was about how this pertains to war and peace, right? To global issues, and I think that's part of the crux of it. That some of the issues of global war and peace are bigger than individuals. That there is no way to move from individual wholeness to nuclear disarmament, or to changing atmospheric gases. That can be inspired by a desire from action that comes about through group level, you know, just anger maybe, but also sureness that this needs to happen. But ultimately there need to be policy changes so that just like individuals will cheat, so will nation states cheat. Right? There need to be protocols in order to mandate that things like atmospheric gases and nuclear disarmament are actually happening.
Then we do. I'm just hang on a little bit because it's actually good because then it gives me the opportunity to clarify some things there. That does make the distinction between, okay, there's a difference between a group of people and individuals, right? So that actually the group behaves different than the individual. Well, actually from Krishnamurti's work, he would actually turn that around. Actually, there is no group. There's only the individual. If there's change on the change on the individual is the change of the group. And how does that manifest? It's somehow that all the parameters or all the mechanisms that are contained in an individual are contained in the group. So change somewhere will change. So that he wouldn't make a distinction between the group and the individual. So I just want to bring that out. Yeah.
So Jaap, you said that if one person changes, and of course we don't know, and we'd all be speculating if. But what is clear, and Heather gave us some examples of that, and maybe that's worth just remembering, this thing that people call social contagion. So in a group like this, if if on average 3 or 4 people are a little more relaxed and open about things, tentative, not aggressive like me, think of the opposite of me, people like that, then that atmosphere sort of spreads, and then it is more likely to produce a feeling of more openness and tentativeness. And this is social contagion. It's not through some magical something that someone's transmitting or some spirit operating, and the mechanisms of that are reasonably well worked out. So what you're saying, at least in a more limited scenario, there's very good evidence for that. So I don't think what you're saying at that level is or if it is an assumption, it's an assumption that is backed by good evidence. Now, whether that at the extreme, let's not speculate. That's all I want.
It may sound like it's in counterpoint, but it's not, because I agree with what Pathik said. But I would add that I think one of the things that one of the actual transformations that evolutionary thinking allowed in science and understanding sort of what we are surrounded by and what we ourselves are, is understanding actually the distinction between the individual and the group. So assuming that your characterization of Kay's beliefs in this regard are correct, then I am going to have to respectfully disagree. That population, as I think of it, population level thinking, which understands group dynamics and understands that groups inherently have variation. Groups have diversity in a way that individuals don't. That, we are multitudes, yes. Each of us individually has even contradictory beliefs in ourselves, but no one of us is as diverse as all of us together in this room are collectively. We cannot be on any single character, on any belief, on any phenotypic character, on anything, right? We inherently have more diversity and therefore more approach, and therefore will also be harder to steer as a group than we are individually. And so, out of that recognition that populations, in the language of biology, or groups, are different, are more complex, are more emergent than individuals are, that out of that actually came the mathematics of statistics. Statistics was born in the 20th century after evolution was understood, to the degree that it is understood. And it's been abused, just like all science has been abused. But that understanding that when you say, okay, there's group A and there's group B, that is not invoking a binary. That does not say that Group A has all of these things invariantly, always, and forever, and Group B has these totally different things always and forever. What that is suggesting is that there are distributions, and that Group A and Group B probably on average share more than they differ, but they are still different. And so understanding groups as these ever-changing, moving in maybe completely nonlinear ways, but moving through time and space differently than individuals can and with less agency, I think is necessary in order to begin to know how we would make good policy as opposed to bad policy. And there's been a lot of bad policy, and it's exactly what, frankly, people on the conservative end of the political spectrum are scared of when people on the liberal end start talking about, especially using phrases like social engineering, but even just talking about policy, regulation, that word is anathema to many people on the right. And there are many of us on the left saying, yes, bad regulation has done so much damage because it unhooks things that we didn't know we were unhooking, but we need regulation. We just need good regulation. How we figure out what the good regulation is, that's a huge puzzle.
I wanted to say that I don't characterize you as aggressive, but probably intense. So that's kind of like, and the more intense people are, I appreciate it because that means they care, in terms of individual and group, from the perspective of peace building, we look at individuals like, yes, the importance of the individual and transformation of the individual and understanding of the individual is important. Also, that the individual's responsibility to the group, that we're kind of like looking at it from that angle, that how much the individual who is changing has the responsibility to the group to cause a transformation in the group, and that's kind of from that angle we are looking at. I remember a few years ago, one of my students came back, from maybe a talk here, and goes like, well, they said, Krishnamurti said that you don't have to do anything. So I don't have to do anything. I'm good. I'm like, well, if that was the case, why was Krishnamurti every season would be going from one location to the other and every time to be talking and talking and talking, if he thought, well, I changed, so or I got it, so I'm good. I don't have to do anything. And I remember Professor Krishna one time, a couple of years ago, he was talking, and he said, I asked Krishnamurti that, you have these schedules ahead of time, like a year or 2 years ahead of time, that says that you're going to be going to this place and that place. Well, how do you know that, the time comes and you will not go? You don't feel like it. You don't feel like it to do it. And he said, well, sir, if the time comes and I don't want to do it, I won't do it. But it has never happened. So it is kind of like the level of, and I'm using the word responsibility in some ways that may not be exactly the word that needs to be used, but the level of responsibility of the individual to the group is important. That how one individual, okay, as changes comes back, but has responsibility of impacting the group, and change directions. And in respect to policies, is that not all policies are, you may kind of go into like criminal justice system and you would say my policy around this is more of social, about restorative justice way of approaching it, which is, so just because there's a policy doesn't mean that the policy is the regulation of punishment. You see what I'm saying? So not necessarily having a policy, it means equal to punishment. that you could have policies inside of the criminal justice to say, well, all our policies in this regard is to have more policies of rehabilitation of a person rather than punishment of a person. So just because they have chosen that rules and regulation doesn't mean that all policies always dictates that, people would be punished. So they chose that route they chose that policy in the realm of criminal justice. That's how. And then Scandinavian countries, they look at, will say, well, our policy is not treat the whole being, and not, don't throw people in the jail and throw the keys out and we're done. And the same approach that the United States has towards that. So, so those are our policies that are the policies of punishment, not policies of rehabilitation. So those are both policies, but those are the ones that we chose to have.
Just one point with respect to the individual and the group. I think that Krishnamurti would say, that the reason, I think he would mention two reasons why he would say that the individual is primary. One reason is kind of intrinsic, which is, he would say, the group is made of the individual. The individual creates the group, and therefore, inherently, fundamental change can only come from the individual. And his other argument would be what you might call empirical, which is, he would say, we've tried changing the environment. We have had dozens of different forms of, cultural structure, religious structure, political structure, economic structure. And regardless of all of these outward forms, the individual has remained as he is, suffering, confused, conflicted, disorderly, and violent. I think those are two of the reasons why Krishnamurti would say that the only fundamental change can only come from the individual. He might have other reasons as well, but I think those are two essential ones.
And it's impossible to argue with that, and it's impossible to say that that's not the case, but is that the only case, and is that the only way it works, might be a reasonable question. So there's no question that a group is made up of many individuals, and presumably the individuals existed before the group came into a particular existence. But there's also no question that the characteristics of any individual in any setting, particularly in social settings where we find ourselves, there's absolutely no question that the characteristics, the average characteristics of the group, the ones that it acquires on average, profoundly influence the makeup of the individual, that is, who is within that group. So even though the individual creates groups, once a group is there, whatever its characteristics are, influence, I don't say they're 100% deterministic, but they profoundly influence the characteristics of each individual within that group. So it's absolutely not a one-way street. And the second point about, we've tried this before. We've tried lots of putting lots of systems in place, and it's possible to say two things about that. One, and I'm particularly interested in what people like Fran who study this think, but there are people like Pinker and others who say that we as humans are on almost every metric so much better off than we were previously. That the rates of violence, both at a group level and individual level, are the lowest that humankind has ever known. That the rates of poverty are the lowest, that nutrition's high, child mortality. I mean, on almost every indicator we care about, although it doesn't feel like that, except climate, humans today are better off than they ever were in the history of humankind. And that this is simply incorrect, this information that you know, there was some sort of idyllic state when people were living in simple groups and were hunter-gatherers. I'm not asserting that because I don't know enough about that. So then it doesn't mean that it doesn't work. Like maybe we just haven't come upon, you know, we need to keep working at it and create better structures and better policies and better things and better systems. And it's certainly a bi-directional thing. So while I don't think anybody would argue about the importance of the individual in effecting change, the argument seems to be about, is that the only way, and in the use of the word fundamental there, as if there is a fundamental in the first place, or is that an assumption?
It's funny that we were talking about that right before we came here. There are a few things. Number one, the numbers shows that yes, we have improved. However, most of that moving has something to do probably with China and people moving from extreme poverty to poverty. So like, you know, it hasn't been all across the board. Yeah, and India. Yeah, so that's people being moved from extreme poverty to poverty, and that doesn't mean across the board we see that improvement. And as we were talking also with Heather, and then what's the cost of that has been to our environment and to other species and to all the things that also along the side we took down in order to push this up a little bit. Certainly the cost of that is not really, you know, justifiable for this little amount of, you know, and more sustainable way of handling it. We don't know if we can kind of continue on pushing people up a little bit without, in a sustainable manner, that we could you know, claim victory on that.
It's a related discussion as to at what cost and so on. Sure. But the numbers don't look suspicious to you. But these are the rates of homicide today. These are the rates of, you know, how many people per 100,000 have been killed in organized violence as in wars. These are the rates of how many are living on less than $1 a day. Those look, they're not fake news, are they?
From keeping close proximity to things, it's not impressive. I don't know, it's just like, yeah. Somewhat, yeah.
So
it depends what goes inside of it. Yeah.
So I would add, without getting into, I assume Pinker is an extraordinary researcher, and that right, and that he's not alone, and that those numbers, those measurements as stated are correct, but they appear to ignore some of the critical externalities, and they appear. So this is exactly what Fran and I were talking about during lunch. They appear to imagine that people are a closed system, that we are unto ourselves sufficient, and that we do not need the water and the food and the air and the climate that we actually do depend on and always will, and there's no changing that until and unless, God forbid, we go entirely virtual, right? We are actually dependent on the things that live outside of where almost all of us live. Actually, unless we're farmers, we are dependent on things far outside of what most of us see. And even if we're farmers, we are dependent on the jet stream and the oceanic currents and all of these things that we are affecting, and that I don't think end up, it's not that the stated statistics are wrong, but that the models themselves don't appear to include those externalities. They just don't include them.
This argument that the state of humans hasn't changed on many parameters does not seem to be accurate. You know, when someone says we're as barbaric as this, as that, as we ever were, there hasn't been a change, these things do not seem to bear that out. That's all. I'm not saying therefore that's the way to go, or I'm not saying that's complete in and of itself. I'm not making any of those assertions. And I was really asking. I wasn't even asserting that because.
Yeah, I would like to just put maybe a little different angle on, because like each method or each scenario that we are discussing, each of the three scenarios seems to also have risks to it, right? And the risk that I see with, for example, with policy and with demonstrations and local non-violent action, as you called it, I think movement and action, is like what you see, like in the American politics. I mean, you get a policy through, and it's been supported by a particular political group, and because the criteria was, which was added after its policy, but then suddenly I heard it has to be good policy. Now, and we don't really have necessarily a track record of good policy. And it's not really clear how the good policy will come about if the people underpinning the good policy, who are making the policies, are not really having the clarity or the knowledge or the information to make good policy. So that's one. So I want to, and then about mythology, of course, you have the big risk, because mythology, of course, I mean, normally it's organized religion that has hijacked, and then you get the whole issues that are coming about through organized religion or organized groups, or Karl Marx wrote a good mythology, and we see. I mean, although he probably had fantastic intent, we've seen what happened in China and what happened in Russia. What's happening in Russia, although it was the particular communist component is maybe almost slowly disappearing. So that's that. And then about the individual one, I guess the biggest risk is a kind of elitist. Isolating, navel-gazing or something. Somehow there's no engagement. So I said all three seem to have their risk, and I just want to see, because you have to make somehow, you know, we have this 20-year window, and you have to put movement in action. So where are you going to put your money? So with the risk in mind. Yeah.
I think actually the biggest risk to the individual level approach is that, frankly, I think it just can't work, because you need 100% buy-in. You need everyone to be on board in order to affect the changes. And all it takes is one person to be acting against to take it down. And so you need a system that is anti-fragile, that is robust, not just robust to chaos, but actually grows stronger with chaos. And so, you know, policies can be built such that they grow stronger, even when there is resistance to them, potentially. And I'm not saying I have those, and I'm ready to hand them out. And you know, in both the cases of, you know, policy or myth, there have been many bad ones, and we can point to many examples where they have done far more bad than maybe even the good that they could have possibly affected. But they have the potential to be built in such a way that they cannot be gamed. So we need systems that cannot be gamed, given how short the time horizon seems to be.
Yeah, I think if I had to kind of like, you know, you asked also that question, like, you know, this 20 years, you know, frame time that we have right now is the time for adaptation. Like, you know, all the policies that we have should be around right now we should be building dams, you know, and kind of like letting people know that, you know, properties and human livelihood is going to be under the water. Like, you know, the ones that it happened in Bangladesh, you know, and just their food go under the water with sea level rising. We need to move into adaptation, because it's going to happen. It's going to have catastrophic, you know, consequences. So right now, that's where we should be going, you know, adapting ourselves to and have policies, and particularly because the most vulnerable ones are the ones that they don't have any voice for themselves right now. They can't build those things. They don't know what's coming to them and everything else. So right now, if we are moving towards, helping ourselves as a humanity, I would say move towards, we have to start adapting ourselves to these things that is going to happen. And particularly, we need to protect those climate change. People are going to receive it in very different ways. So those should be the ones that we are moving
I understand
towards.
that, but my question was how are the good policies going to come into being? I mean, if you look at the Paris Climate Accord,
Yeah.
I mean that seems to be
Into
it was very minimal.
being
right?
is by putting the information out and scientists back it up and communication wise, get the information to everybody and be very frank and upfront about the information. Kind of like for the scientists to be very forthcoming and talk about that, and they stay behind the policies and they stay behind the change and communicating those things to the public, and use the mass communication as a way to directly talk to the public and ask to the things to be built bottom up, and ask the people that they can to take policies that would be good, not for everybody, particularly for those that they have no voice in the matter.
Sorry, this is not consecutive or responsive to what you guys are talking about. With respect to Steven Pinker, I haven't read him, but insofar as he maintains that on the basis of various parameters of murder rates and violence and various other poverty and various other parameters, that humanity is doing better now than it has in the past. Insofar as that's his argument, I wonder whether or not he's taking into account, for example, some variables outside the relatively narrow arena of Homo sapiens. I wonder if he's taking into account the monumental and horrific suffering that we inflict upon animals in factory farms. I wonder if he's taking into account the fact that humanity is perpetrating an extinction, a mass extinction on a scale that only comes along once every 10 million years or 100 million years. It is so utterly catastrophic. And to pretend that humanity is doing well in the face of that absolute disaster seems to me incredibly narrow-minded and short-sighted. With respect to what would represent a fundamental change, I think, at least in Krishnamurti terms, it has to do with the fact that the psyche as it currently exists is very, very self-centered. Almost everything we do is oriented around self-interest, which is based on a deep and fundamental illusion that is at the core of the structure of the mind and which determines most of our behavior. And fundamental change means coming to terms with and eliminating that deep and very, very destructive illusion. And it's not at all clear how any kind of social policy could even pretend to get at that level of the psyche.
And as far as Steven Pinker goes, I don't know if it matters anymore if we're getting worse or getting better. I think that if we take a look at the things that are going on with the environment, with displacement and war and violence and everything, we can see that something needs to shift. And I don't know, maybe I'm the only one in the room, but I don't know anyone that's ever been like, I had this, foundational shift and change in my life due to this government policy. For me, it always comes from somebody else sitting down, a connection with somebody else, looking at something that is real. I think that if everybody in the world could empathize with people in Syria, that there wouldn't be a refugee crisis. I think that if everybody knew what the effects of our consumerism was, if they could see them and see themselves in the people that are being affected by it, I think that that in itself would change everything. And so for me, it's how do we start that process? How do we talk about it? How do we share that information? I don't know where it goes from there, but yeah, how do we start that?
I think, you know, like maybe earlier on, you know, we talked about like, you know, just keep close proximity to the problems of the world, like to feel sensitive and to understand our impact on one another. Like certainly people, it's too much of a trauma for people to listen to what's happening in Syria, and everybody wants to exit from that or any other disaster around the world that, you know, people, they just kind of like, you know, it's too much to have the gut to sit down and actually go through it and see what's going on. I think we have to keep, you know, keep becoming sensitive about these things by being close to all these to these things and understand and keep ourselves informed and keep close to it so we understand what does that mean, to understand, like, you know, all the impact of our consumerism from here to impact of our food, the way, you know, just the way it's being processed and the way it comes to me and the way it gets trashed and it gets, so kind of, you know, really getting close to all of those things and not to pretend that it's not there, it's not happening. And it's only, you know, people with certain genes, they created those problems and they deserve to be punished for it, you know, that way.
That social thing of, right, fear is one of those emotions that's more easily spread. Anger is one of those more emotions that spreads faster and is stronger. And so it's, how do you talk to somebody who's afraid and angry? How do you break through that kind of?
Like Fran said, we can't all care. None of us can care equally about all of the trauma in the world. So we will choose. And sometimes we will make poor choices, and sometimes we will make better choices about which things to care about. But I think actually this is a place for narrative. This is a place for the role of narrative, that creating narratives that inspire and that provide hope, that are more universal, that, you know, the news stories out of Syria, people have a block reaction to, because, oh my God, it's yet another one of these, is what many people will feel, right? Whereas if we can create story that feels like it touches all of us, or it could, and, you know, there's no reason not to make, you know, not to fictionalize one of the real stories, but that risks trivializing the reality of individual lives, that having stories that have resonance for all of us, and that then we all know, so we can share them. You know, like to the degree that we do have shared myth now, it's out of Hollywood, right? Like most everyone would understand a Star Wars reference in here, and there are those who would say that actually is helpful. That doesn't happen to be my thing, but, you know, can we create story that is inspiring and hopeful and actually speaks to the experiences of these traumas and the genocides and the displacement, that provide a way out, a model for a way out that then we can reach for, and we are connecting on a one-on-one level. And we can say, but this reminds me of, and then we have a shared cultural reference to move forward with. I think that's part of how I believe that story can help.
All right. So I had an original thing that I wanted to ask about, but just kind of Heather, yes, you were just saying about narrative. It reminds me of how in a lot of cultures there are stories that are told to the children. And it has very basic ways of relationship is embedded in these stories. And so as a child hears this growing up, it becomes inherent. And it's not necessarily someone saying, okay, let me educate you on how to be aware or how to relate to one another. It's all integrated in something as innocuous as a story. It seems so innocent and basic on the outer level, but within it is all these tiers of what's really being transferred to the younger generation. And so that's one thing that comes to mind, that how story can be used to not just continue dialogue, but to actually be a carrier of, I don't want to say truth, because of course, all the meanings that can show up with that, but that very basic thing that helps us be connected, so whatever you want to call that, but allows the opening for relationship, for connection, so that we can even have the awareness that it is possible to come together and make the necessary changes. But kind of going back to
May
what
I
I
say one
originally-
thing quickly
Sure.
before you continue? Now I forgot what I was going to say. Oh, I know. I think in my language, what I heard you, what that inspired me to think was that story reaches us at a level that is deeper than the conscious level, and so it can spread. It can take hold in a way that then will emerge at times when hopefully it's needed, and so we can think. What came to mind, for instance, when you were talking about children's stories, was The Boy Who Cried Wolf. We all know that story in here, and it's an important one. It's a very important one, and that in that case, it's not one of inspiration and hope. And I'm trying to think of stories like that. The other story that came to mind, the Boy Who Cried Wolf. So if you're constantly seeking attention and claiming things that aren't true, when you really need help, your people will not be there. And the other story that came to mind is also, unfortunately, not one of inspiration and hope, but is just as forceful. So this reveals something about my parenting, but when my boys, I have two boys, were relatively young, I read aloud to them The Lord of the Flies as a cautionary tale. When they were old enough to understand, when they were 8 and 6 or so, and we talked about it, and we now have it as a reference point. Now that they are a little bit older, this is not what ye shall become, right? But that's also, although the conversation that comes afterwards is done in an environment of love and care, the story itself is not one of inspiration and hope. And I'm wondering, I find it a little bit alarming that the two stories that come to mind right away when you were talking were ones really of warning, like this is how not to behave, as opposed to look at what happens. The hero's journey is wonderful because it is about the way that, but as one person can transform both himself or herself and potentially the world. So.
And the African spider stories, I cannot remember the name of the spider. I want to say Anasazi, but I don't think that's the name. But yeah, it was along that lines of these very powerful messages. And then you had an opportunity to dialogue and unpack that, and people's psyches start shifting without necessarily having the conflict, because it's a story. It's not I'm right and you're wrong. It's just a story.
And it's not dictatorial, and it's not teaching, it's not education, right? I'm not now receiving wisdom. We're having fun. This is story and music. That's part of why, because they are understood to be in the realm of play.
So, I was going to try to get to my question now. But were you going to add? Okay. So the other piece of that, I think the term was social contagion. Did I hear that correctly? So kind of going back to the funeral scene. I'm just wondering, like, what is useful out of that? You know, because there is that connection. For those people to show up to that funeral, there is something there that connects them to the person who died, so that there's that common thread. So regardless of why they're crying, there is something there that connected them. And as they were able to emotionally deepen that connection, so they might have come in with a mental connection, but now the emotional connection is, how could that positively be allowed to unfold, you know, in group settings? So, you know, when we talk about policymakers, what would happen if they had that opportunity to come into a setting and experience something that they all came for one reason, but then they experienced that connection that allowed them to be open to relationship on a level that they hadn't even thought about before. And so kind of bringing something unconscious, conscious in a way that moves us forward. And so if our policymakers are able to be exposed to that, how does that affect what they create? And I don't want to actually necessarily pull in an economic term of the trickle-down effect, but I think we need trickle down, trickle up, trickle to the side. We need the trickle of all the different possibilities, but what if?
So, so most of us, are here because we've been interested in one way or the other in the issues and the things Krishnamurti had to say. So coming back to that and coming back to this sort of suggestion of Jaap's that we examine assumptions, I'd like to again remind us to examine, well, what lies other than Krishnamurti's assertion, what lies underneath that assumption that there is a kind of observation of what is that is possible. That's, you know, question number one. Is there the possibility of such an observation of what is? This implies both the actor observing and the possibility of seeing what is, because there's a whole bunch of stuff that says that we don't have the capacity to see what is, or it's very, very, very partial. Most of what is unconscious and needs to be there, and so on. So that's one that I'd like to just hear people's thoughts on. And two is, even if there was this possibility, then what is the basis for saying that that produces change? It sounds perfectly reasonable on the surface of it. And the counter side is even more reasonable, that if you don't understand what is, or if you don't see what is, how is something going to be different? That's perfectly reasonable. But it doesn't follow from it that even if there is such a seeing, that it will, you know, inevitably produce some sort of radical change. So I just want to ask that again. I don't.
So I had something else in mind, but I'm going to try to connect with what you were saying. So and I think for me, it connects to the it connects to that issue of interconnectedness, and the video that you showed yesterday, the third video, where this guy was in a way exposing in a very rational and factual based some kind of approach, that you got a sense of this interconnectedness as not something abstract, but something kind of real. So makes me wonder if there is something about that reality that could be internalized for evolutionary purposes, as it were, like something, maybe a crisis is required. I know that we have many crises, but maybe this is an extra one, and somehow, you know, maybe at the moment there are many crises happening at once, and I wonder if that is what we can consider a shift, a mental shift, as it were. It's almost like, I don't want to say like an update of the software. I think Heather put it that way the other day. It was something like, you know, the culture and our psychological makeup. It's definitely this sense of self, of this sense of how to put it without sounding, let me think. The way we see ourselves, it seems to have has served us very well in terms of survival, but there must be this interconnectedness issue, this framework that might be missing from the software, as it were, and that the crisis could actually bring that perception, just not because you know, in order to end suffering, but it could be almost like an evolutionary advantage to get to. I know that I'm making a bit of that's a jump, right? But I'm just putting it as something, as a just bear with me, as a supposition, right? That if that was in place, that's the way I feel that it connects to the internal change that maybe Krishnamurti is talking about. Something about seeing what is in that regard, something that, some connectedness that we are constantly missing at a visceral level. Yeah, I'm sorry. One more thing, only to Patik, because I see. Do you think that's a big jump, what I just proposed?
Particularly your use of the word evolutionary purpose and evolutionary adaptation and so stuff that wait, evolution has no purpose, how can you say that? And as if it's a tool to go somewhere, and when you understand that process, you understand it's not a tool, and you can't use, it's not like a GPS system that you already know where you want to go, and now let me use the tool of evolution versus this or that. It doesn't work like that. It's fundamentally so I got stuck on that, and then I couldn't hear the rest of what you were saying, although you didn't mean it that way. I'm just telling you what happened in my mind. Yeah, and an advantage is always context dependent. So there are no absolute advantages. So there's no such thing as an advantage that is invariant in terms of time and context. In you know, in the context of an atmosphere that has oxygen, it's an advantage for a system to be able to get more of it out. But that same system that gets more oxygen would in fact be a disadvantage for that system if there wasn't oxygen, but if there was carbon dioxide or something. You see, there are no absolutes. So the word advantage has to be in reference to what, or in what context.
Right. So let me try some little adjustment and just to see if we. I think the way I was thinking about it is in terms. I might be wrong. In terms of the survival of the species, if there is a mutation that can happen that could give us an advantage, that for me then it doesn't seem like a big jump.
No, even. Well, it's a debate about whether it's even about survival or not. But even if granted that, even if you hold survival as the criterion to frame advantage, that too is completely context dependent. So, for example, in the context of food source being, I don't know, certain sort of complex carbohydrate being available, like only cellulose or something, then it would be an evolutionary advantage for a digestive system that can digest that as opposed to a system that can't. But then suppose that changes and the food source is, something very different. Then, a system that can digest complex lipopolysaccharides is not an advantage, and in fact, preserving it, carrying it around, maintaining it is a disadvantage. So even for survival, the conditions that you need, if they change, it's not an absolute.
I'll add 2 sentences just to continue exactly what Pathik was saying. Everything that is advantageous evolutionarily is dependent on the particular time and space where it is. Misunderstanding this is what led us to such atrocities as eugenics and social Darwinism, which I have to put in quotes because it egregiously includes the word Darwinism, and the Third Reich, right? Imagining that there is some best, there is some permanent absolute best, and that anyone ought be, or that evolution has aspired to a best, is a gross misread of how evolution works, and it has been used to great devastation on the planet. So, what could enable us to survive depends on the conditions that we ourselves will be creating as we move towards that future. And so we need, I think, there's a metaphor in evolutionary biology from the 1930s from one of the great biologists from before the discovery of DNA, Sewell Wright, who proposed an idea of adaptive landscapes. It's a metaphorical landscape wherein for any particular trait, you are unlikely to be in your current time and space on the maximum peak for that trait, the best possible character for that for your particular time and space. But on this landscape, there may be higher peaks, but in order to get there, you can't just fly. You have to go into a valley. You have to go into a less adaptive place before you can get to a more adapted place. So this, I'm leaving a lot out, and it's a bit complex. But the idea, what that might suggest then is that in order to get from the place where we are now, which by, say, Pinker's estimation, looks really good for a lot of people, right? Like looks like much better than it was for the average person than 100 years ago, say. But to get to a place that is actually sustainable long-term and more just and more fair in all of this, we may have to go through something worse. And we can't know what that thing is, that higher peak is, but what we can shoot for is we're going to have to go through this thing, and we can get onto that foothill. And once we're on a foothill, if we've created systems that have positive feedback built into them, then we can start climbing a higher peak. And that is what I would say we are shooting for. We aren't trying to define what that higher peak is. We have no way of knowing it because we won't have that time and space doesn't exist yet, and it will be created as we are moving into it. But we have to figure out somehow how to get ourselves moving towards it rather than defining the final goal.
But to just add one thing to what Heather said. One thing she said is that we don't know what things will be like in a different time and place, and we cannot know them now. But then she also said that they will be determined by what we do now. And while that's correct, that's incomplete, because they will also be determined by things that have nothing to do with what we do. And the history of major changes on this planet that gave birth to things like the land masses and the massive things in weather and all of that, the vast majority of them had nothing to do with the activities of the inhabitants of this planet. They literally, again I emphasize, literally originated in events in outer space. So it's not just what we do, we will contribute to it, but it also is whether a big asteroid comes along or something like that. And that is actually the likelihood of big changes in conditions is higher originating in space than through the activities of the inhabitants of this planet.
I would say it certainly has been in the past, but we have many more people now with greater technological capacity than we ever have in the past as well. So I suspect that power is switching.
Yeah, I got a bit confused, and I also don't know why, because we somehow we're looking for this 20-year window, right? And so the evolution. No. I'm just trying to bring it back to something. And so I feel so we're not really talking about evolution. We're talking about what brings about change. And but of course, I mean, if Heather is right and said, well, everything is evolution, then of course, then it's evolution. But yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
What we can do is, if we're proposing other kinds of changes,
Yeah.
and thinking of models for those,
Yeah.
do they violate?
Exactly. Yeah. Because I somehow think that what Francisco was suggesting is that there's a kind of tension created by the crisis we're in and the consciousness of the crisis we're in. I think it's different for maybe my parents who lived in the Second World War. I mean, they were not as aware of what was happening on a global situation. I think it might be, and I don't know how to measure that, but it at least feels like we're in a different situation now. Yeah.
So one thing, just for the sake of argument, one thing I don't think anybody's even brought up is to put a massive amount of investment in furthering the development of technology and making it move faster. So just a couple of examples. So in terms of feeding us, if this thing moves as quickly as we hope it will, then we'll manufacture food in factories. We won't need to farm. With what we know about cloning and stem cell biology, we can have an almost indefinite supply of what today is called meat, but it won't come from animals. It'll just come from cells. There won't be any cruelty. There won't be any CO2 emissions from livestock, and it'll be cheap because it's really very cheap to replicate cells and tissues and so on. So that's one technology that could make a big dent in the food problem without contributing to CO2 and so on, if we invest more in that. If we invest in automation and robotics and so on, and make it so good that the scenario actually happens that Fran is saying there are many projections of, that 30, 40, 50% of the jobs will be gone because people won't need to do them, then that could be fantastic, because the level of
that's good, but I try to keep it on a different trajectory. This is I like this is also good as strategizing how will the planet feed itself, etc. But I think there's something in the question of, is this an unusual crisis that we're facing? And then we mean the crisis, of course, the environmental crisis. We're all clear. The window seems to be small. And then about the other crisis, we seem to be diverted. Although we might not say, well, the world might not be more violent, but it's pretty it's pretty rough out there and pretty ugly out there, and that might be sufficient, right? And the awareness of it is enormous. I mean, when it took me till the 80s or the 90s before I knew what was happening in Nanjing in China during the Second World War. I mean, now we know what's happening very accurately and quickly. So there's a tremendous awareness of the crisis, actually informant and of the mechanisms in it. There's not much hope. I mean, there's not really they're not hopeful narratives. Is that an ingredient? And I think that's maybe, is that an ingredient, a stimuli, not a stimuli for evolution, because I would steer away from that, because then I entangle myself in something that, and it's clear the scope is not, but is that a kind of, can that be a trigger, or is that has the potential of a trigger for a change of direction, but not an evolutionary direction?
Like we talked this morning, I mean, like, the problem is staring at us in the face. Like, I don't know what we are waiting for. It's just like it's staring, it's right there. All of them is the staring. And I don't know, if we want to wait for even bigger crisis, that maybe it would wake us up. But I'm just looking at our faces, and our faces, despite of our information, our, being able to know instantly what's going on with this genocide, with Sudan, with Yemen, with Syria, instantly we know what's going on. And I think there is an expression on our faces that, just like the jaw is like, and the eyes and everything else, that it seems like, it's staring us in the face, and I just don't see any movement. And I don't know, what else, like how much harsher should it be in order for me to, start acting.
Yeah, two comments. One has to do with what Francisco was saying. I think I got his point that it's not like evolutionary in the biological sense, but it has to do with something that make us aware that we are all connected, and this in the sense that some kind of awe that tell us, hey, it's not only what all the bad things that are happening, but there's also a huge beauty in the world that can be combined somehow to get some balance in all the crises that we are facing. And this kind of, I will just give certain examples that I have heard. For example, astronauts, that when they come back to the Earth and they cross the atmosphere and they look back into, they have seen real the space, what is out there, and they have this sense of awe that says, wow. I'm not a mother, but people who is here mother, I have heard that motherhood and the moment of birth gives you this sense of awe that says, aha, there's something more than this. There should be more than this. It's not only science, it's not only statistics, numbers. And coming from a scientific background, I can tell you that science is not enough. It's not enough because you need the sensitivity to come and say, hey, this is happening. And my numbers, and yeah, I can guess that is what you are trying to say with narrative, but it has to be, for me it's very, very impressive that right now having you four in front, it seems for me again a fight. Like one is trying to defend the method of the other, when I have the feeling that it has to be combined. Science cannot do it alone. It needs the consciousness that Krishnamurti was talking about. It needs the internal reflection to say, okay, where I am as a human being, as a part of a group, and what I'm doing what is my impact in the full society. And if all the scientists, with all the full technology, they don't have this sensitivity to come back and say what I'm doing with all my science, then it's all trash. This is all what I wanted to say.
respond to that? Is this on?
I don't
Well,
know that
when
there's-
I came
hol-
down-
Hold on a second. I'll just say I don't think you said anything that's counter to certainly what the scientists up here believe. I mean, it's what we've been saying, right? That we need to use the approaches that are most holistic and best, but that there are better and worse ones, and that some will not work, and that we should try to assess which ones will work and which ones won't. I mean, I didn't know that that's what we would be doing here. That's not what I came to OI to do, but it is what Jaap asked us to do. So we were asked to assess between approaches.
And respectfully to point out that if you preface a statement by coming from the background of science, I can tell you this. Well, that might be your deficiency. You might not be a very good scientist. You can't speak for science just because you have a credential, just as, someone can't. Point one, point two. I really don't mean to fight with you, but I can't help pointing that out, that you can't assume, you can't preface a statement like that. Two, there's actually a huge amount of work on the basis of awe in science. I don't know if you are familiar with it or not, but there's a biology of awe. There's a lot of work on awe in science, very serious work. So to make statements like, we don't consider awe, and that's science can't do it, is wholly unfounded.
I hope you're not talking to me. I'm with you, man.
No, I wasn't telling you. Not yours.
Now it's mine. Okay, is this on? Yes. First of all, I'd like to thank the four of you for coming here and giving your presentations. It was all very good. And when I came down here, my wife said, "Don't shoot your mouth off. Don't shoot your mouth off." And I thought, okay, I can do that, but, we're almost at the end. So I have actually some questions, but statements prior to the questions. And actually the first question is, just so that I know who I'm talking to, is how many people in the room besides me have taken LSD? Cool. Cool. All right. So at least I'm talking to a few people. Did you take enough where your ego melted? Okay. So I'd like to revisit what you were saying about there is no psychology without biology. And I agree with that. Anybody that doubts that should go to the state hospital and try and have a conversation with somebody that's had a prefrontal lobotomy. But your example was dopamine. And dopamine is very specific, that when it's released into the bloodstream, it immediately goes to the pleasure center of the brain, correct? It doesn't go to the liver, right? So I have an experience, whatever experience, and it's marvelous, and I'm flooded with dopamine, and I get into this state, pleasure state, right? And then, I don't know, I visit the pharmacy, and he gives me this little tablet that I take, and it floods my system with dopamine, goes to the pleasure center, and I'm in this state. So, is one experience more legitimate than the other? That's the question. One question. Okay. And then, back to Krishnamurti. Krishnamurti once stated that meditation is the choiceless awareness of what is. Now that's probably the heaviest statement I've ever read. or heard or listened to. And it's this choiceless awareness, this state that allows you to go beyond the images that conflict with true relationship. It's when it's that state. And going back to chemistry, I'm thinking, what is the chemistry involved in Krishnamurti's brain that allows him to experience choiceless awareness? And Krishnamurti says, well, nobody can lead you to the truth. Nobody can tell you how to get there. There is no path. Be a light unto yourself. And yet, although he eschewed all tradition, he did practice yoga. He was a vegetarian. He has his little quiet room here. So I'm wondering, what is it about Krishnamurti's lifestyle that maybe we might emulate that would change that brain structure? And of course then there's the chemistry. You drop the LSD, and that's the only time I've ever even experienced anything close to choiceless awareness. I mean, it's impossible to make any choices or any judgments. So then the question is, first we had the legitimacy of the experience and the pill, and now I'm asking about the legitimacy of Krishnamurti's immediate revolutionary transformation of oneself as opposed to going to the drugstore. And then I would make one further comment. We never did get to your question about, David, about the relationship of biology, psychology to world peace. And I would suggest that world leaders all take acid, and that that their physiology all runs on predominantly estrogen rather than testosterone. That would solve a lot. Okay, I'm done. I shot my mouth off.
Well, let's also hear it for testosterone then. With regard to the earlier questions, I think what you're asking, one way to reframe what you're asking is, given that we appear to be able to hack our way into, what is the phrase? Unself-conscious awareness? Choiceless awareness. Given that we appear to be able to hack our way into choiceless awareness or to approaching it, are there some hacks that are better than others? And our lifestyle choices is seeking solitude, is meditation, is yoga, are entheogens, hallucinogens, better or worse than one another? And that list is far from complete. My tendency, I really didn't know we were going here. But my tendency would be that, it's just within the realm of, say, the chemistry, the entheogens, the hallucinogens, the more complex, the less, if it was synthesized in a lab, I trust it less, even though it may be purer, but that if if you want to hack your way into a consciousness, into a choiceless awareness through an organism that co-evolved with people somewhere, and there are people out there who have been using it shamanistically for some amount of time, there is a good chance that you can get somewhere interesting by using psilocybe mushrooms or ayahuasca or peyote or any number of other things. LSD is a little different, but it's in the same tradition, and it just happens to be synthesized again from a fungus, right? Again from ergot. It's definitely akin to a place that you can get to through meditation, through yoga. Extreme sports is one way that people approach finding what has sometimes been termed flow, right? And it's going to be different for each of us, how it is that we best get there. So again, there won't be a universal answer. I don't think any of the things that you listed, and now that I've added one thing to, are wrong, and all of them will work well for some people.
So we're coming to the end. I was just wondering if we can make our closing comments, maybe the panel first. David had a bad headache. He just told me his migraine started, so he had to go. But I would just suggest maybe, because it's after 4, make some closing comments, and then we can we wrap it up.
So just to say that I'm really grateful to be here, and for this exploration, to kind of creating this space for us to talk about, like, what are the discipline that we have been working through, kind of like share that, and also hear the questions, and it was a learning experience for me, particularly being in the presence of 2 scientists that they're talking about it from the angles that we are at the recipient of that. We use those data and information and say, well, see, when we are talking about pieces, that is kind of like, see, the scientists, they said we are interconnected, so it got to be right. So we are the recipient of the work that you do, and then we kind of refer to that for the legitimacy of what we practice. But I think, if there is anything that it has become even more for me, or if I have any suggestions of any sort, is that for our younger generation to get involved and get engaged and become sensitive about things that are happening. So individually to change and collectively to move. I think that's kind of like important to become more and more. My take is that to become even more vested in individually to change, and also move group-wise, move forward with things. So I appreciate everything that was said here, and all the questions and all the contributions from everybody. Thank you.
I would just like to thank you all for having me and for allowing me to engage and listen to this remarkable 3 days of conversation. I don't have anything else to add. Thank you.
Yeah, so we are connected, and we are a product of connections, and it's really nice to have some time and space to go into these without a too fixed of an agenda, even though Jaap tried to make it fixed by saying 20 years and all that. But no, it's really nice. It's really nice. We don't get too much of a chance to make a fixed amount of time and effort into not having too fixed of an agenda, and it's not common for entities and institutions and organizations to create that space. They do this sort of thing all the time, but they have a tight and focused agenda. We want you to come together because at the end of these 3 days, we'd like to have X, Y, and Z done. So I think this sort of thing is really important, and the fact that it's not just let's just go back in agreement about X, Y, and Z, that it allows the space and the openness. So thank you for that, and I hope we'll continue that, and I hope all of you will also create those opportunities in whatever world you live in for yourself and others around you, just to have a little bit of time and space without the pressure of let's produce a product immediately. That's
Well, the last 3 days have been great. Thank you for being here, and I have learned a lot, and also I talked to other people and sharing with other people, and also I listened to other people talking about what they got out of this conference. And thanks a lot for putting this conference together. I know it takes lots of time and effort and cost, and let's not forget that, to put this thing together. Thank you very much.
I have nothing to say, but thank you.
Closing comment.
Just one thing, Fran, I'll need help on the term again, but the all-inclusive thinking, system thinking, and then like something that you said too. So I'm an engineer, right? And I don't get very much of that system thinking. Most of my field is not much about that, but there's something really different when a city is built based off of community spaces and not off of the commercial business. And just not to go too far into that, but I think it just brings the point of like the intention that you bring to your work, what you value, what you spend your time and energy on is reflected and does manifest outward. And so sort of the individual, you know, each one of us has the ability to change wherever we are.
Okay, I had originally asked for him to share, but since he insists, I did get the proper name. It's Anansi, A-N-A-N-S-I, the African, or specifically Akan, spider folk tales. So if anyone is interested in taking a look at those. And thank you. I've fully enjoyed everyone who presented and everyone who shared, so thank you.
What are we saying? What's the
Well, you're the last one. I'll say something. When we're closing.
Did Kabir say anything?
Huh? No, if you want. You don't have to. We'll say thank you.
Okay.
I really appreciated that there were so many minds from different, backgrounds and fields having discussions about many things that I think about or worry about, but don't often find the safe space to be able to learn and hear other perspectives and to share. So I think for me, I felt the spirit of, you know, Krishnamurti and his teachings and his life, really nurturing peaceful, open-minded dialogue. And I believe that doing just that is something that we can do to transform ourselves and the individual that makes up the group, whether you believe that or not, and society. And that is what's necessary, I believe, and vital. So I really appreciate everybody being open and honest in the discussions that I've had, and for you sharing, you know, your insights, especially the speakers over the course of the entire conference.
Well, thank you all for showing up. That's how we made it possible. I really enjoyed it. Not only just to be, I just enjoyed sitting here and listening. Well, we do it again.